I still remember that morning in Monterey. The smell of salt and metal drifting in from the bay, gulls circling above the recycling plant, the hum of trucks echoing off the concrete. I was walking my usual route behind the landfill fence when I saw a soggy cardboard box, half collapsed in the mist. At first, I thought it was just waste, another forgotten thing left to rot. But then the box trembled. A sound, barely a whimper, rose above the wind. I crouched down, my boots sinking into the wet gravel, and peeled back the flap. Inside was a white German Shepherd puppy, 4 months old, but so small, so silent. His fur was matted with grime and oil, white turned to gray. His eyes, they didn't look up, just fixed on nothing, wide and glassy, as if he'd already stopped expecting anything good from the world. When I reached out, he flinched so hard that the box shook, his ribs pressed against the cardboard like twigs, his paws stiff with cold. Someone had left him there deliberately. The box lined with a few damp paper towels, a fast food wrapper crumpled in the corner. I could see his breath forming tiny clouds in the air, each one slower than the last. I whispered, "Hey, easy now," but my voice felt like it didn't belong in this place of rust and echo. I slipped off my jacket and wrapped him gently, his body trembling through the fabric like a tiny engine trying to restart. I didn't know if he'd make it the truck, but I knew I wasn't leaving him there. He didn't move much in my arms as I carried him to the truck, just a faint tremor running through his chest, the kind that makes you hold your breath without realizing. The morning fog clung to everything, turning the scrapyard into a ghost town of twisted metal and dripping pipes. When I placed him on the passenger seat, he didn't even lift his head, just curled tighter, nose pressed into the corner of the seat like he was trying to disappear. I started the engine, and the vibration made him shiver harder. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other lightly resting on the bundle of jacket that held him. Beneath the dirt, I could feel how thin he was, bones sharper than they should ever be on a puppy that young. His fur, once white, was caked with black streaks of oil. A faint smell of rot mixed with something sweet, like old milk, filled the cab. I rolled the window down and tried to breathe. Halfway through the drive, he let out a low whine. It wasn't pain exactly, more like confusion, the sound of something realizing it's still alive. I glanced over. His eyes met mine for the first time. Dull, frightened, but searching. That single look hit me harder than I expected. When we reached the small clinic near the wharf, I whispered, "You're okay now, little one," even though I wasn't sure if that was true. He stayed silent, breathing in short, uneven bursts as I lifted him again. So light it felt wrong. The vet's door chimed as we stepped inside, and for the first time I saw his paw twitch, a tiny, fragile attempt to move toward hope. The vet, Dr. Ramos, took one look and called for warm saline and blankets. She didn't ask where I'd found him right away. Maybe she could see the answer in the grime on his fur and the smell that clung to him. We laid him on a stainless steel table under a heat lamp. The glow made every rib stand out, each breath shallow and unsure. His fur looked almost silver in the light, but under it you could still see the blackened streaks of oil near his neck. When the warm saline touched his paw, he whimpered. It was the first real sound he'd made. I stood there uselessly, watching as she cleaned the dirt from his face. I remember thinking how fragile he looked, like one wrong move would make him vanish. She glanced at me and said softly, "He's young, maybe 4 months, but he's been through something rough, starved, dehydrated, scared." I nodded, unable to find words. My jacket was still wrapped around him, soaked now from the heat lamp's moisture. I could see the smallest flicker of life returning, his eyes following her hand, his chest rising a little steadier. When she placed a small bowl of water near his muzzle, he sniffed it, but didn't drink. She looked at me again. "He'll need time. You can't rush trust." As she spoke, his paw shifted, brushing against my wrist. It was barely a touch, just a twitch, but I felt it like a plea. I stayed beside him until closing, the hum of machines and his faint breathing filling the silence. Outside, Monterey's evening fog rolled in again, thick and cold, but inside that small room, I started to believe he might stay. That night, I couldn't leave him at the clinic. Dr. Ramos agreed to let me take him home under one condition, that I'd bring him back for fluids in the morning. She handed me a small packet of antibiotics and a quiet look that said, "Don't get your hopes up." I promised nothing, but deep down, I already knew. This little life had found its way under my skin. The drive back through Monterey was slow, the fog heavy enough to blur the streetlights into halos. I kept glancing at him in the passenger seat, wrapped in a clean towel this time. His breathing was uneven, but steadier than before. Every bump in the road made him flinch, so I whispered nonsense just to fill the silence. Stories about the ocean, about the gulls that nested near the pier, about nothing and everything. At home, I turned the heater on low and laid him on an old fleece blanket near the couch. For a while, he didn't move, only stared into nothing. Then, carefully, he lowered his head onto his paws, as if testing whether the world would allow him to rest. I sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, terrified it might stop. Hours passed before I saw it. The tiniest stretch, one paw extending forward, his body relaxing into the blanket. A sigh, deep and shaky, escaped him. It wasn't much, but in that moment it felt like a promise. Outside, the waves hit the shore somewhere beyond the fog. Inside, a broken creature had finally closed his eyes without fear. The morning light came pale through the window, soft as a whisper. I woke to the faintest sound, a rustle, a breath. He was moving. The puppy lifted his head, blinking against the quiet. For the first time, he looked around, ears twitching to the cries of gulls beyond the glass. I held out a small bowl of water. He hesitated, then leaned forward, lapping slowly. Each sip sounded fragile, like something broken, learning how to work again. I whispered a name, Arlo. It slipped out before I could think. He looked at me, not fully understanding, but something in his gaze softened. I said it again, and he blinked, as if memorizing the sound. When I took him back to the clinic, Dr. Ramos smiled faintly. "He's responding," she said. His heart was steadier, his temperature normalizing. She offered him a spoonful of food, and for the first time, he ate. Tiny bites, clumsy and uncertain. Back in the truck, he didn't hide this time. His chin rested on my arm, eyes half closed, trusting the warmth. The world outside still smelled like salt and diesel, but inside that cab something had shifted. Hope, small and quiet, had begun to breathe again. Bath time was harder than I thought. The moment the warm water touched his fur, he tensed, eyes wide with panic. I spoke softly, letting him hear my voice over the sound of the faucet. The water turned dark right away, thick with oil and dirt, swirling down the drain like everything he'd survived was finally being washed away. He tried to stand, but his legs shook under him, so I held him steady, one arm beneath his chest. His body was so light it barely pressed against my hand. Bit by bit, the white began to return. Streaks of clean fur showing through the grime, uneven but beautiful. I could finally see the real color of him, like snow touched by sunlight. When I wrapped him in a towel, he shivered, then pressed his nose into my wrist, a faint sigh escaping his chest. That small gesture nearly undid me. It wasn't fear anymore. It was trust, fragile but real. I sat with him on the floor until he drifted to sleep, the towel still damp between us. Outside, the fog rolled against the window, soft and endless. I watched it move and thought how strange it was that something so broken could start to look whole again. One breath, one heartbeat, one quiet bath at a time. By the third week, Arlo began to walk on his own. At first, just a few shaky steps across the living room, his paws slipping on the wood floor. But each day, he tried again. He'd glance back at me after every step, as if asking for silent approval. And every time I whispered, "You're doing it, buddy." He started to eat with more appetite, licking the bowl clean, tail twitching just slightly, a tiny flicker of the dog he was meant to be. The wounds along his belly had healed, leaving thin pink lines like quiet reminders. His fur was still patchy, uneven from where the oil had burned through, but his eyes had changed. They weren't empty anymore. They searched, followed, connected. I took him outside one morning. The sun had broken through the Monterey fog, gold light spilling across the wet pavement. He froze at first. The sounds, the gulls, the breeze, everything new and sharp. Then he took one cautious step onto the grass. The moment his paws sank into the damp earth, something inside him shifted. His tail lifted, uncertain but alive. I stood there watching, feeling the weight of every day that had led to this one. For the first time, Arlo wasn't just surviving. He was becoming. The first time Arlo barked, it startled us both. It wasn't loud, more like a rough, broken sound, caught between fear and wonder. But to me, it felt like music. He was finding his voice again. That afternoon, the fog had lifted, and Monterey looked almost kind. Sunlight flashing across wet rooftops, the ocean breathing slow in the distance. I took him down to the pier, wrapped in his harness that still hung a little loose around his chest. The air smelled of salt and fried fish, gulls swooping low over the waves. He walked beside me, still cautious, but his steps had rhythm now. His head held a little higher. People turned to look, some smiling, others whispering, but Arlo didn't hide behind me anymore. He sniffed the air, tail wagging once, shy but real. We sat at the edge of the dock, water shimmering beneath our feet. He leaned against my leg and sighed, a sound so human it nearly broke me. The wind ruffled his fur, clean now, but still thin in places, and I realized how much of the world he'd missed before this moment. When I looked down, his reflection shimmered on the water, not the frightened shadow from that box, but a dog learning to live again. I whispered his name, and this time he looked up, not scared, not searching, just there. Arlo began to dream again. I'd find him curled on the couch, paws twitching, soft sounds escaping his throat. Not the cries of fear I'd heard before, but quiet whimpers of life returning. Sometimes he'd wake suddenly, eyes wide, searching the room until he found me. Then his body would relax, tail brushing the blanket once before sleep took him again. He followed me everywhere now, to the porch, to the truck, even to the corner cafe where I'd stop for coffee each morning. The barista started keeping a small cup of whipped cream just for him. He'd wait patiently, ears perked, tail sweeping the floor in slow, happy arcs. People noticed him. Not the scars, not the patches of missing fur, but the way he looked at the world, open and unguarded. One afternoon, I took him back to the landfill. I wanted to see if he'd remember. He sniffed the air, then turned toward the old fence, the place where I'd first found him. For a moment, he froze. Then, slowly, he sat down beside me, pressing his shoulder against my leg. No trembling this time, just silence. Acceptance. The wind carried the same metallic scent, the same hum of trucks in the distance, but everything felt different. He wasn't a rescued puppy anymore. He was a survivor standing on the same ground that once tried to forget him. A month later, Arlo ran for the first time, not the careful, hesitant steps he'd taken before. This was full speed, pure freedom. His paws splashed through the shallow surf at Del Monte Beach, the waves catching the sunlight around him like shards of glass. I called his name, and he turned mid-run, ears flying, eyes bright with something I hadn't seen before. Joy. He came racing back toward me, sand spraying behind him, and when he reached me, he didn't stop. He crashed right into my legs, tail whipping, tongue out, alive in every possible way. I laughed. Really laughed for the first time in a long while. The wind carried the sound out to sea. We stayed there until the sky turned gold and the gulls began to settle on the water. He lay beside me, head on my knee, chest rising steady and strong. His coat had grown thick again, white as the breaking surf, no trace of the box, no shadow of the fear, just peace. As the tide crept closer, I thought about that first night, the trembling, the silence, the smell of oil and rust. Now all I could smell was salt and sun and the warmth of his fur. I whispered, "You made it, Arlo." He opened one eye, sighed, and pressed closer as if to say he already knew.